Welcome back to the last day of the week in the first ever Treaties Recognition Week here throughout Treaty Territories 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10 in what is now Saskatchewan. My name is Mary Musqueam Culbertson. I am the Treaty Commissioner for Saskatchewan. I am from Keezakoos First Nation and I am the first woman Treaty Commissioner. So today the message I want to bring is about current issues. We've talked about before treaty, at treaty, and broken treaty obligations, and now I'm going to talk about today's current situation when it comes to our treaties. We still have those broken treaties. There's a lot of work being done, and you'll hear so much advocacy and politics in the news. When you hear about FSIN, Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, that was created from our forebears, right, grandfathers and grandmothers, who decided they wanted to be treated equally. They knew the treatment of being put on reserves and segregated, being treated differently from when they went off to war and fought side by side, and then coming back and being treated completely different and completely wrong. They knew that wasn't right, and they wanted to form advocacy groups. They wanted to form organizations that would fight for their inherent rights, their treaty rights, and basic human rights. That was how we have today the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. We have the Assembly of First Nations, which started out as the National Indian Brotherhood. Those organizations, its very foundation, some of it started right here in Saskatchewan, what's now Saskatchewan. We have high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. And we know that because of the years of advocacy that have been done by organizations such as the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, the Native Women's Association of Canada, by groups here in Saskatchewan like RITSIS in Regina, like the Prince Albert Grand Council Women's Commission, like the FSIN Women's Commission, Darlene Sicot, Myrna LaPlante. The work that those women do and have been doing, it was falling what seemed like on deaf ears. Our women were still going missing because of violence that was perpetrated by colonization. Colonization is the effect of the newcomers coming here to Indigenous lands and bringing new ways, new Western ways of knowing, and replacing Indigenous ways of knowing through whole systems. We had plenty of community advocates, survivors, family members advocating for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited people. That inquiry did happen, and it came out with volumes called The Calls to Justice. It is important every one of us make ourselves familiar and aware with the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It's all based on violence that was created by colonization. Colonization happened when newcomers came, when the treaties were entered into, and those treaties started being broken immediately, bringing new ways of understanding, of values, all of these effects of colonization that did not mix with Indigenous ways of knowing and practices. Has resulted in a lot of the trauma we see today. And when I talk about trauma, I mean the people who are hurting. They are suffering from the effects of colonization, and we see that in high rates of addictions, of incarceration. We see that in our homelessness. But most of all, we see that in the amount of discrimination First Nations and Indigenous people face here every single day. When the truths about residential schools started coming out, the AFN at the time, Assembly of First Nations, lobbied intensively to ensure that there was a settlement process, because people were going through other processes, through courts that are very adversarial and is not what Indigenous people had traditionally. So we had court systems that were imposed here that today even the common person, any person on the street, is not going to understand these legal systems, let alone Indigenous people who these systems are just completely foreign to values, to traditions. So in 2007, an Indian residential school settlement agreement was created between the AFN and Canada. In 2008, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper read out the apology from the Government of Canada. After that apology, and through the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, or I would take out after that apology, I'll just say, through the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement came the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was mandated to bring out the truth, to have survivors gatherings, to record survivor stories, and the other part of that settlement agreement was the independent assessment process, where survivors could seek compensation under a specific guidelines and framework, so they could get redress for the abuses that happened to them. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wrapped up that piece of their work. It came out with its final report, and it came out with 94 calls to action. These were more than just recommendations from another inquiry that sat on a shelf in Ottawa or a province and didn't get fulfilled. They made these calls to action to all Canadian citizens. And today we are still living those calls to action out. We are trying to meet calls to action. It is something that is momentous, and it's set this population on a whole new track. We are talking about things we didn't talk about before, right? That weren't talked about to us as students in these school systems, as young people, as youth, as lawyers going to school. Those things weren't talked about. They weren't taught in government institutions. They weren't taught in jails, in prisons. Right? I had to learn these really hard truths on my own. And sometimes that is sure not easy. And we are still living those effects today. We have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all the work that it did. And today we have the Special Interlocutor's Office on unmarked graves and missing children. That work is very important, and it is there backing up the truth that our elders and survivors have said, and it's dealing with a legal framework that will be recommended. One of the other contemporary issues that we have today that is a way to start righting some of the wrongs of the past that are there because of broken treaties, because of the ignoring of inherent rights and self-determination, is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2007, the UN General Assembly voted to accept the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that had been worked on for over 30 years. Canada did not vote in favor of the UNDRIP at the time. In 2021, Canada finally endorsed and accepted UNDRIP as a base set of standards for Indigenous people. Today, we have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that is making its way through Parliament, and a draft action plan on how to implement the UNDRIP. The UNDRIP was worked on for 30 years. It is the base set of rights for Indigenous peoples across the globe. And here, that would mean the realization of treaty obligations. It would mean the realization of the self-determination of First Nations people. It would mean getting rid of the Indian Act. It would mean supporting communities and nations with the capacity that they need in order to be able to govern themselves outside of the Indian Act that was imposed on us. The Indian Act took away our traditional forms of governance. It created divisions within our nations. It created election systems that have become adversarial, where we don't treat each other very well. Colonization, residential schools, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the loss and use of lands and resources and traditional ways of life attempted to decimate First Nations people. We are still here. We are still thriving. We are still advocating for our rights. And it is the duty of all the citizens who live in these treaty territories, who benefit from the treaty obligations our ancestors made, to make sure that our governments are living up to the treaty obligations and encouraging them to follow the voices of the people who live in these treaty territories. When we say we are all treaty people, that means we're all supposed to benefit from these treaties. But some of us benefit in much different ways. We see generations and generations of intergenerational wealth on one side of the gambit. And the other side, we see intergenerational trauma. We see intergenerational poverty. When we have populations who are supposed to be living as treaty partners and assisting each other, and instead we see hatefulness, we see ignorance, we see discrimination, and we see it each and every single day, and it is very alive and well. It is our jobs as citizens of these provinces, as people who live here and who get to benefit off this beautiful land that we live in, that we're ensuring that the Indigenous people, the First Nations people who were here long before the rest of us, are being honored, that the land is being cared for, is being looked after, and the resources in the land that were meant to be shared under treaty are just that, shared as treaty promises. Thank you, Miigwech, for participating in the first Treaties Recognition Week. I hope to see this ongoing for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. Thank you.